Go.
Well, okay, we're all set. We have 5 speakers on this final session. Deva Woodley is absent.
Yeah.
Yes?
Deva Woodley.
Deva Woodley. And so after each of our speakers speaks to us for about 5 minutes, we will have some general conversation, and we will definitely take questions from the floor. Marc Plattner will start us off. Thank you, Marc.
Thank you. I'm about to launch the beginning of the end of this conference. I want to thank Jim and Helena, who I had not met previously, but for organizing such an interesting meeting.
Oh, yeah, microphone.
All right, okay. Is it on? Yes, okay. Recent developments have prompted some well-founded fears about the health of democracy in the United States. But the situation in this country, I would say, should be seen as part of a larger and more deeply rooted global trend. That, at any rate, is how the situation looks to me after having spent the past 35 years closely following the ups and downs of democracy around the world. It's easy to sketch democracy's global trajectory over the past half-century or so. It reached a low point in 1975 when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi proclaimed a state of emergency, temporarily curtailing democracy in India and drastically reducing the proportion of the world's population living under democratic rule. This prompted Daniel P. Moynihan, who'd been U.S. ambassador to India, to lament, and I quote, "Liberal democracy on the American model increasingly tends to the condition of monarchy in the 19th century, a holdover form of government that has simply no relevance to the future. It's where the world was, not where it's going." Happily, Moynihan was wrong, dead wrong. Because that very moment marked the beginnings of what Samuel Huntington later labeled the third wave of democratization, which began in Southern Europe with the transitions in Greece, Portugal, and Spain, and then flowed on to Latin America, subsequently reached parts of Asia and Africa, and culminated with the inundation of European communism. According to Freedom House, by the first decade of this century, some 60% of the world's countries qualified at least as electoral democracies, and some 40% as liberal democracies. At that point, perhaps inevitably, the spread of democracy slowed to a halt, though there was nothing like the kind of reverse wave that Huntington had identified after previous periods of democratic advance. But by 2014, as the Journal of Democracy, the journal I edit, began preparing its 25th anniversary issue, the signs had become ominous enough for us to decide to focus on the question, is democracy in decline? And though there was some sharp disagreement among the contributors to that issue, published in January 2015, most of them in fact did conclude that democracy was entering a period of global decline. And I would say that developments since then certainly have vindicated the decline as perspective. Not only have such stars of the third wave as Turkey, the Philippines, Hungary, and Poland suffered serious backsliding, but disturbing signs of growing illiberalism have emerged even in the advanced democracies of the West. Let me just briefly address the complex relationship between liberalism and democracy, which has been a key theme of this conference. And I'm probably echoing what others have said, but my view is that in today's world, the two, in fact, do tend over the long run to be found intertwined, to be in tandem, even though conceptually they're quite distinct and always in some tension with each other. Democracy is ruled by the people, either directly or indirectly through their elected representatives, and it holds that the will of the majority should prevail, while liberalism is a way of determining not who should rule, but what limits should be placed on the powers of any ruler. Such limits, like those spelled out in the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment, are aimed at protecting the rights of individuals and minorities. And under a democratic government, therefore, they unavoidably reduce the scope of majority rule. So paradoxically, liberal democracy seeks at one and the same time to empower the will of the majority and to constrain the will of the majority. Today, liberal democracy is increasingly the target of criticism, but its opponents are more likely to attack its liberal than its democratic aspect, something reflected in Viktor Orban's pronouncements in favor of illiberal democracy. Hardly any governments or political forces, with the exception of a few militant Islamist groups, are willing to openly repudiate democracy. So why has the attractiveness of liberal democracy been declining? I think it stems from a combination of two large factors. The poor governance and economic performance, of many democracies in recent years on the one hand, and the resurgence and increasing boldness of some authoritarian regimes on the other. In particular, the economic success of China has undermined the notion that liberal democracy is the only political system compatible with a truly advanced and prosperous society. And moreover, the growing geopolitical strength of China and Russia has nourished a sense that authoritarianism, not liberal democracy, may be where the world is now heading. The global decline of liberal democracy is serious, I believe, but not irreparable. The China model has great appeal for rulers in developing countries who hope to achieve economic growth without allowing political freedom, but very few people in the advanced democracies want to move to China or to live in a country with a Chinese-style government. I think it's interesting that in contrast with past eras, when some dictatorial regimes in other parts of the world had significant support in the West, it's striking how few people these days are enthusiastic boosters of any of the countries that define themselves by their enmity to liberal democracy. Even Daniel Ortega's Nicaragua and the Chavistas' Venezuela hardly find any backing these days. Moreover, the demand for democracy, as reflected in survey research, remains high in most parts of the world, even where dissatisfaction with the performance of democracy is rife. And this reflects the fact that people still value individual freedom and want a government that's accountable to the people. So the heart of the problem is not in the demand for democracy, but in democracy's shortcomings in supplying what citizens want. And high among these desiderata are security and prosperity, and to be successful in the long run, liberal democracy needs to deliver on these. So, of course, we need to work to improve the quality of governance in our society, something easier said than done. But we shouldn't forget that citizens also seek other goals, in particular freedom and equality, two key goals of liberal democracy, though goals that are sometimes in conflict with each other. So the full and simultaneous implementation of both freedom and equality is an all but impossible task. And as French historian François Furet put it, our societies never reach this point. Democratic society is never democratic enough, and its supporters are more numerous and more dangerous critics of democracy than its adversaries are. Justifiably dissatisfied with dysfunctional government, citizens are likely to undervalue the imperfect freedom and equality delivered by their imperfect liberal democracies. And the result is that the blessings of liberal democracy are too often discounted, especially by those who have never experienced life under other kinds of regimes. So I'm happy with the echo of Lincoln presented in the introduction to this panel on the program that regards liberal democracy as the last best hope of Earth. For whatever its shortcomings, I think the record of other kinds of regimes over the past century and a half should have taught us that the alternatives are always worse and often unspeakably worse. We tend to take for granted the benefits of liberal democracy and to be complacent about its durability. In that respect, I think the events of recent years have given us a salutary wake-up call, reminding us of what we stand to lose, to meanly lose, as Lincoln would say, if we fail to defend it. We can draw some consolation, I think, from the fact that crises often have brought out the best in democratic societies. And I think there's some reason to hope that this will again be the case in the years and decades ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me at this very interesting discussion, which has been thought-provoking and genuinely interesting. I'll begin with Lincoln, which Marc ended with. As the last best hope of Earth, I think it's not maybe used by Lincoln more than once, but the famous use is in the December 1st, 1862 address to Congress, where he lays out the case for the Emancipation Proclamation, which he issues a month later. And the reason we are the last best hope of Earth is not simply that we're a democracy. It's that we're actually going to liberate the slaves and begin to rectify this monstrous injustice that has marred one of the major, maybe at the time the only major lasting democracy in the world. And a democracy that continued to tolerate slavery, or certainly that was indifferent to the spread of slavery, Lincoln spends most of the 1850s arguing, is not necessarily worth preserving, let alone being the last best hope of Earth. The doctrine Lincoln fought in the 1850s was called popular sovereignty. The kind of early, I guess, echo of populism. And it was, in fact, Douglas said, let the citizens of every state decide whether they're a slave state or the new states, this was, let them just, the newly admitted states, let them decide whether they should be a slave state or a free state, and we don't care what they choose. Douglas himself preferred freedom. He was not a friend of slavery, really, but he thought as a practical matter this was the only way to keep the Union together, which may have been right, since Lincoln's alternative led to a civil war, but Lincoln thought it not worth saving on those grounds. And there, I think, is a lesson that liberty, I don't know if liberty matters more than democracy, but let's put it this way, the adjective in liberal democracy is as important, or I would say actually truly more important than the noun. And that liberty is what is most at stake. Liberty is harder to defend and harder to maintain, I think, in some ways, than democracy, which democracy appeals to a very natural sense of equality and people wanting to govern themselves. Obviously, it can be taken away in terrible ways, but there's always a kind of natural basis among the many, if I can use an old-fashioned term, among the demos, as we were saying, for democracy, which is not so much the case for liberty. Acton, I think, Lord Acton says somewhere, I've not really read Lord Acton, but Hayek quotes him in I think, in the Constitution of Liberty, maybe in that essay on why I'm not a conservative. Hayek quotes Acton as saying that the party of liberty will always be a small minority, and what it has to ally with other forces to prevail, and he says that's a very risky thing, because of course these other forces don't necessarily stay on board, so to speak, the agenda of preserving liberty. And but that's just the reality, that liberty is always going to be a more rare and a more taste and a more difficult thing to maintain than mere democracy. So I'm here to say a word for the Party of Liberty, which remains, I would say, in some ways, even in the U.S., which has such a deeply embedded liberal tradition and a tradition of liberty and a narrative, as people say, of liberty and all that, even so, something that's, I think, more fragile and more tenuous than democracy itself. Tocqueville was well aware, and I think one thing that happens, of course, is that everyone discovers over and over again all these problems, limitations, and difficulties with liberty in various forms of liberalism. And many of them are real problems and difficulties. They seem to get, and every serious liberal thinker has known about them and argued about how to mitigate them, Tocqueville most famously, but I mean, there are a million examples of this, of course. But I think we've almost gotten so, the intellectual life of the country and of the modern world, I suppose, has become so interested by all the problems of liberalism that it's forgotten the basic case for liberalism, or understanding liberalism in the kind of old-fashioned sense as a regime of political and economic liberty, with all the difficulties and modifications that one would want to add to sort of. I don't mean that in a simple-minded libertarian sense, but in just a more normal, sense of self-government and respecting rights and respecting fellow citizens, and a certain ability of economic liberty as well as political liberty. I don't think this depends on any kind of utopianism. In fact, it's an anti-utopian point of view. Someone mentioned before that Mill expected truth in the with his characteristically, I suppose, limited 19th century view compared to us geniuses here in the 21st century. I think sitting here at the New School, can I say with no disrespect to anyone sitting up here, that this is an inferior level of discussion than the New School would have had in 1947 probably, or 1927, and therefore we should be less confident about our great progress and superiority to our grandparents and great-grandparents' generation. I mean, so similarly with Mill. Mill did not believe that truth would emerge inevitably from the marketplace of ideas. Mill believed that you couldn't, in fact, the reason he's such a keen defender of liberty is he has a rather low opinion of what the common opinion will be of the, quote, truth of any day, and he has to exaggerate, I would almost say rhetorically, the kind of case for liberty in certain ways and make it more popular than it might otherwise be, to try to impress upon people that they cannot suppress liberty, they ought not to, even if they're very confident about some truth. And he has a lot of explanations for this, including the truth itself will become a mere dogma unless it's challenged. I mean, he kind of gives away a little bit to the people who are more progressive, like EJ, who think that, you can get to some of these truths by saying, well, at least you should even want the dissenters, because it'll make you kind of stay more alert in defending your truth. But I think he's a skeptic about real progress in that way, or at least he's very aware of the possibility of regress as well as progress. I don't think we have to sign on to, it's nice that you like Condorcet so much, but we do not have to sign on to universal enlightenment, which is not going to happen. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that right here. And, earlier we were talking about how every voter is a philosopher. And not even every philosopher is a philosopher, not even most of them aren't. And incidentally, philosophy means the search for wisdom and not having wisdom and not knowing the truth. So we really need to, I think, guard the party of liberty needs to guard liberal institutions, and it needs to do so in a hard-headed way, accepting the limitations on everyone's ability to know the truth, on everyone's ability to assume that progress is going to take care of a lot of problems. I do come back to Tocqueville, who for me is maybe the deepest of these liberals who understood the problems with liberty, a Democrat sort of, who understood the problems of democracy. And Tocqueville says somewhere, I think in Democracy in America, that after going through various problems with liberty, he says something, but nonetheless, he said, in any age I would have respected liberty, but in this age we must cherish it, or something like that, or revere it, something like that. I can't remember what the French is. But, and I think that really, for me, the lesson of the last few years is a reminder of the precariousness of liberal democracy, especially of the liberal part of liberal democracy, and the need for the party of liberty to be as strong and forceful as possible.
Great. Astra.
All right, can everybody hear me? I want to begin by thanking Jim and Helena for inviting me and inviting my film, What is Democracy, to open this conference, especially because it was sight unseen, so that was quite a leap of faith. And I see now that I could also make a film called What is Liberalism, and it would be just as complex and confounding and probably even less marketable. So I could continue my path of just career killing, career suicide with that. So yes, you've given me an idea. So I walked in this morning, and there was a lively discussion that you just mentioned about whether people are philosophers. So anyone who saw my film knew that my film is sort of an exercise in approaching people as if they are philosophers, incapable of reflection. And so I was, quite happy when someone here pushed back on Paul Krugman about that point. I think part of the, I think people aren't engaged philosophically very often. And I do agree with you that many philosophers aren't philosophers, but I do think many people actually are philosophical. And I think there are scenes in the film that make that point very strongly. Michael came up and mentioned the scene with Ellie Brett, the barber in Miami, who just name drops Machiavelli and went on this hunger strike for 6 months to save the library. And lately I was reminded of the quote from Edmund Burke, who I know was neither a liberal nor a Democrat, but he says, he has this famous quote about the occupation of the hairdresser, bringing no honor to anyone, right? It cannot be a position of honor. And he says that such men ought not to be oppressed by the state. So he's very benevolent. Barbers shouldn't be oppressed, but the state shouldn't suffer oppression, the oppression of having such men rule. And he says that, to allow people like that to rule might seem like it's combating prejudice, but it's actually going against nature. It's being at war with nature. What?
Don Herzog wrote a terrific book called The Trouble with Hairdressers.
Who did?
And Don Herzog, he's an intellectual historian. Actually, that's an essay. But he writes about how, in fact, hairdressers were like salons. And that was kind of like, in a way...
Yeah, people chat at the hairdressers. That's what people do. That's where you find the wisdom.
Exactly. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. The Barber Shop. Yeah, and they still do. So, but this attitude, right, this attitude that it's sort of against nature was baked into our society. Our founders thought there was a natural aristocracy. We were talking about that yesterday. So what are we to make of someone like Ellie Brett, the barber in the film? He's this young man with tremendous intelligence, a lot of potential, and yet by the time he just barely entered his 20s, he found himself incarcerated like millions of other men who are disproportionately poor, black, brown, right? So, the United States is 4% of the world's population. We have 22% of the world's prisoners. Is this story emblematic of the failure of democracy, the failure of liberalism? Is it just a personal failure? So the film is an attempt to make an argument about the political capacities of people, and I acknowledge the problem of majority rule, right? There's the people I show the demos in a way that's not always pretty or flattering, and yet I do think there's a tremendous capacity out there. It's an artistic argument for the democratization of political theory. And I think political theory is this discipline that we do have to democratize. It's not just pure philosophy and metaphysics, nor is it a science that's based in empiricism. It is something that everybody should have access to and participate in, even if everybody's insights are not equally brilliant. In his essay of the Ruling of Men, W.E.B. Du Bois talks about something he calls excluded wisdom. And this, I think, the film resonates with that concept, the concept of excluded wisdom. And Du Bois talks about the wisdom of working people, black people, women, and even children. And he says that this is a wisdom democracy needs. He doesn't just say, like, oh, we should listen to them out of pity or something. He says this is wisdom that democracy actually needs. It's necessary. And the failure of our society to cultivate this democratic wisdom, this excluded wisdom, it's not a failure of the demos. And his proposal for rectifying these exclusions, it involves, he basically makes the argument for industrial democracy, economic democracy. In other words, his solution isn't like, oh, let's listen to people more or kind of register their opinion in a focus group or a poll, but let's empower them economically, right? Through democratizing power, democratizing ownership. And this is, his concept of abolition that Angela Davis mentions in the film. The concept of abolition in that sense isn't just a sort of tearing down of old structures of exclusion, of slavery, of segregation, but building new institutions, sharing power, and building solidarity. So Du Bois's solution points towards the sort of specter that's haunting this conference, which is the specter of socialism. And I was quite keen to hear Ira Katz-Nelson's remarks yesterday about the New Republic and the way the New Republic was instrumental in spreading the idea of liberalism. And you talk about this in your book as well. Because that very morning I had signed a contract, and I signed a contract with the New Republic. And I signed a contract to write the anchor essay of the forthcoming issue on socialism. And the editor said, the little boat in the logo is changing course. It's tacking to the left. So there's something in the air. The wind is blowing in that direction. And I think it would be interesting to talk about why. But I also want to talk about, what it is, just some characteristics of today's socialists, who are, mostly young. They're not all young, but a lot of them are young. I would say that there's a recognition among this new generation that liberalism actually needs socialism. and that liberal freedoms are simply too thin to survive concentrated economic power. They also recognize that the main threat to liberal democracy today is not the demos. We're not living in a moment where the threat is majoritarian, tyranny of the majority. It's actually the tyranny of the minority. So the threat is coming from plutocrats, not the popular will. I think our discussion about immigration and the polls showing that people are actually, quite open to immigration, that xenophobia is not as popular as one might guess, that, not as popular as the media makes it out to be. We can look at the Electoral College and the fact that that minoritarian institution, trumped the popular vote. I just want to end with, another example, which is, it's on my mind because of yesterday, right? So the example of climate change. Who has been? The last panel was on truth. So who is behind the sort of misinformation, and who has put millions of dollars, into funding disinformation campaigns to confuse people about the science behind climate change? Nevertheless, polls show that people actually do believe in climate change. They do trust scientists. They would like to see action on this issue. But the resistance has not come from the majority. And it's taken a young democratic socialist, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to sort of break through the consensus and get this issue on the radar. And it's an issue of life and death for all of us. And the chaos that we've seen to date, pales in comparison to the chaos to come if we don't move fast. So I think that this is a generation that does not discount the blessings of liberal democracy, but I think that it's a generation that wants to extend them and that takes them seriously. And I think that we can only do this by addressing economic issues and recognizing that we live in a very different moment than the mid-20th century. Thanks.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Is that okay? So I'm going to actually say quite similar things to Astra, phenomenally. So at this conference's opening panel yesterday, some of you will recall, Ira Katznelson noted with some sadness that liberal had become a dirty word on the left, guilty as charged. He understood, of course, that liberal qua epithet speaks to a disdain for unrestrained capitalism, rampant inequality, and cruel austerity, among other turpitudes. Correlation is not causation, he stressed. Liberalism's vulnerability to these ills should not, he urged, be grounds to dismiss its more vaunted and currently threatened values. It seems fair to call up a Philosophy 101 point from a great classical liberal here, David Hume. Causation is inferred from consistent correlation and contiguity. And for much of the 20th century in this country, that thorny compromise, liberal democracy, has seen the liberal position consistently make fewer compromises with democracy and egalitarianism, and ever more deals with capitalism. Victims of that be damned. When this becomes the almost unerring norm of liberal tendency, as it has, certainly for those of us born around the time history allegedly ended, would be a little nuts or ideological to refuse to infer causal links. A note on causal links. I'm reminded of Bertolt Brecht's 1935 comment, "How can anyone tell the truth about fascism unless he is willing to speak out against capitalism, which brings it forth?" I should bracket that and say, in part. Liberal is not newly a dirty word. Phil Oakes famously sang in 1965, "I cried when they shot Mr. Kennedy as though I'd lost a father of mine, but Malcolm X got what was coming. He got what he asked for this time. So love me, love me, love me. I'm a liberal. Plus ça change." All of which is to say, if liberal democracy is marked in large part by its adaptability, and I think that's true, we are not wrong to speak of the troubling realities it has adapted to, not as accident nor bug, but as habit and tendency. If we are to build better better political habits, and so better realities, we can and must use a number of liberal tools, rights frameworks chief among them. But better we see them as tools. They are insufficient shields and blunt weapons. I think I was asked to be here alongside my comrade, Astra, to offer an illiberal intervention of sorts, calling upon my glorious Occupy Wall Street days. And I'm sorry, Jim, to disappoint you, but I'm not going to indulge in insurrectionary juvenilia. I will say, however, that I do think we witnessed, in the various square movements of 2011, some incredible examples of hyper-localized, direct participatory democracy, unreliant, yes, owing to size, on traditional liberal institutions. These were exercises in democratic practices, messy and limited calls for direct engagement with and rethinking of a polity, and a reckoning with the functions of power, which does not end at the ballot box. Occupy, for all its many faults, was broken up more, I'd submit, by its context, a small effort within a hegemony, and very, very brutal policing. No, we were not building the united statelessness of the People's Commune of Occupy, but embryonic as they were, their philosophical and political internalities were not the main problem with these necessarily temporary social movements. And hey, as everyone said, we changed the conversation. That is almost always achieved through extra-institutional collective action. If I use liberal as a dirty word, and I have, and do, it is in part due to a tendency among centrist liberals in politics and the press to be on the right side of history only once it is in the past. Just yesterday, Nancy Pelosi called the Green New Deal the Green Dream or whatever. Exciting. Knowing this, and knowing that the historic compromise of liberal democracy has in many ways evolved into a commitment to compromise itself above the content of social goods. I say with confidence that we cannot seek to defend a democracy worth its name by preserving and bolstering liberal institutions and values, free speech, democracy dies in darkness, the rule of law alone. We limit our resistance to Trumpist, racist nationalism if we confine that resistance to what is permitted by the norms of liberal democracy. In 1968, the late, great John Berger highlighted a conflict inherent to mass legal and peaceful demonstrations, which I think highlights a relevant paradox here. If the state, quote, if the state authority is open to democratic influence, the demonstration will hardly be necessary. If it is not, it is unlikely to be influenced by an empty show of force containing of no real threat. It's safe to say we live in a moment when it is clear and correct to distrust the state's openness to democratic influence. I would have said that sentence before November 2016 too, but that's not to say it's not worse. It's also safe to say that mass demonstrations, more easily enabled today through social media, do not constitute the threatening spectacle of people power and strong organization that they once did. I also think it is fair to say that liberal democracy's most staunch defenders today are rarely interested in posing a threat to operating powers. As such, I leave room for illiberal interventions. I saw crucial and justifiable political behavior in the revolts that we saw on the streets of Ferguson and Baltimore. I submit, too, that liberal appeals to capital T truth, not the nuanced views Sophia was offering, will not break through to a fascist epistemology of power and domination. There is no right to punching a Nazi, but I defend that too, and I have at length. You can Google it. I insist that we do not whitewash history. To argue, for example, that the civil rights movement achieved what it did in spite of, rather than as a result of the mixture of not nonviolent and nonviolent action is spurious at best. It was fun to learn yesterday that in the 6th century CE, democratia was also used to mean riot. I'm not inciting. I'm simply noting that the struggle for social justice will be stymied if we rely only, although we must also rely, on the institutions enshrined by liberal democracy. I can repeat this bit here, but Astra was just talking about it. I wanted to also raise Du Bois's idea of abolition democracy as the road not taken after Reconstruction. The structures of white supremacy were not dismantled. New, inclusive, egalitarian, indeed socialistic institutions were not built. And indeed, there is much to fear today about losing more of the values and protections we might hold dear for those of us who get to enjoy them. But I think the need for abolition democracy is as urgent today as ever, and certainly no less urgent in the last 2 years. The demand for prison abolition, or at least vast decarceration, and open, or at least far more porous borders, are no more utopian than it is dystopian to consider our mass incarceration crisis and nationalist border fanaticism in the face of refugee crises. The demand for free healthcare and education, robust workers' rights, and I'm not even going to talk about the means of production, a Green New Deal, even considering, and I think this is a very interesting idea from social critic Ben Tarnoff, the nationalization and collective ownership of our data. These ideas are no more utopian than it is dystopian to behold the sheer fact of a billionaire, while Amazon workers piss in buckets, or the concentration of all of our commodified data in the hands of 5 companies. A number of the very reasonable demands I mention are already finding room on policy platforms, thank you AOC, but all of them were generated and gestated in leftist social movements and workers' struggle. All of them should be practical goals, apertures only, to political imaginaries, not endpoints. Being alive on a not dead planet, not in a cage. Enfranchised, not starving, and sick. These are basic conditions for democratic participation. If liberal democracy is incapable of delivering them, and I believe it is proving to be, far away as we are in this century from the sort of social liberalism of someone like John Rawls, then is it all too sullied a compromise with which we should be compromising further?
Okay,
Michael.
back to the mushy mainstream liberal to wrap things up. You've made it. I'm the last speaker. And I will try to stick to 5 minutes so we can have a little bit of a conversation. I didn't write anything down. I'm just going to go through some thoughts and reflections I have from sitting here listening today. So we started out this morning talking about immigration, and I want to quickly just return to that because immigration is immigration is not the threat. The controversy over immigration, the anger over immigration is fundamentally the threat to liberal democracy in the world today, right? I mean, it's much more complicated than that, and we could talk about a lot more factors than that. But that's fundamentally what got Trump elected. That's fundamentally what's behind Brexit. That's fundamentally what's behind the rise of AfD and the other parties in Europe, and so on and so on. Well, you know, my feeling is that there's only so much that any liberal democracy can do about those resentments and those angers. They're always going to exist. They're very strongly felt, these volkish impulses in people, and they're very easily exploited by the right demagogue who happens to come along. They cannot be snuffed out. They can, however, be lessened. They can be ameliorated, they can be constrained, they can be made less important. How? Very simply, by having an economy that functions for everybody. By having an economy that functions for everybody, that produces general prosperity, that produces more equality, and that does more for regular people and makes more investments in their lives and makes them not stand around and stare at all these billionaires. I completely agree with you about all of that. So that is what will save democracy. We use the word democracy, and we think of the word democracy as being built around a certain set of rights and ideals, and the vote, and majority rule, and political and legal equality, and so on. But I submit to you, friends and comrades, that if we've learned anything from the Trump presidency and the other cataclysms that we've witnessed in Western Europe and around the world, we should have learned that maybe democracy has an economic element to it. That maybe there are certain basic fundamental economic conditions that have to be met in a society for that society to be a democracy, to be a real democracy, to count itself a democracy. And we know roughly what those are. There cannot be this kind of inequality. There cannot be this kind of concentration of wealth. There cannot be this kind of oligarchic rule. It's an interesting thing, isn't it, that we don't think of democracy at all as having an economic element, yet the word that is kind of its, not quite its opposite, but its antipode or something, oligarchy, it has an expressly economic element. It's about wealth. And we here in this country are hurtling toward oligarchy if indeed we are not already there. So that's what we need to change. And how do we need to change that? Well, again, I don't want to get to be, I don't want to be too impolite and blunt, but you know, I don't think of it so much as our institutions failing. I think of it as a certain group of people who have gotten hold of our institutions and wrecked them for their own selfish purposes. I think the institutions can be salvaged, but they have to be wrested out of the hands of the people who are currently perverting them. That's one point. I want to make one final point, and I'll finish. There's another word that fits in this kind of conversation, along with liberalism and democracy, and that word is republic, because we're a democracy and we're supposedly a republic. Democracy means, of course, the people rule and the people have rights. Republic means we are a nation of laws, but you know, we are increasingly a nation of laws for some, for the oligarchic few. And we have now a United States Supreme Court that, you know, a corporation is an individual, and that's going to remain the case for a long time with this court. But we have a Supreme Court that probably pretty soon is going to strike down whatever is left of campaign finance laws. So there's going to be no limit on contributions anymore at some time in the near future. And that means that, you know, Charles Koch can just buy every member of Congress from Kansas and wherever else he wants. That's not democracy. That's not a republic worthy of the name. They're going to strike down maybe, well, they're going to uphold aggressive gerrymandering, and they might even strike down the independent commissions that some states are passing to try to rein in gerrymandering. Finally, Yuval this morning mentioned the principle of one person, one vote. That's not safe. That's not necessarily safe, I don't think, with this Supreme Court majority. Clarence Thomas hinted in an earlier decision a couple of years ago that the one person, one vote was poorly defended. I can't remember exactly the terminology, but Alito said something similar, and who knows what Gorsuch and Kavanaugh think. Now, you may not know that much about one person, one vote, but its history is tortured in this country. It didn't exist until 1962, 1964. What existed before that was a travesty. It was not democracy. And if they undo Baker v. Carr and Reynolds v. Sims and Westbury v. Sanders, forget it. We're not going to have a democracy. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marc. Do we have any comments from up here, from our speakers? Yes, Jeff. Oh, and then James.
These were great comments, especially well, I just want to say they were great comments. I very much agree with the last three, I would say. And I would like to press Natasha a little bit. And so in two ways. Well, one way. That story you told about Pelosi and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So that first came across my Facebook feed. It was, I think, a piece that Saliza wrote at CNN. I'm not sure. But in any case, it was linked to the interview. I read the interview. And in fact, what Pelosi said was much more than that snippet of what she said. Now, there's a reason why I'm saying this. What she started by saying that she basically thought that the new Congress people, she was particularly talking about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the other Democratic Socialists, actually, that it was fine that they were doing what they're doing and they didn't need it to be generally popular. And then she went on to speak about the Green New Deal in a way that was a little bit derisive, but yeah, okay, fine, it was derisive. Pelosi is now leading the effort to advance H.R. 1 in the House, which is the democracy bill that is like doing, in fact, like all the things, not that you're talking about, but that Tomasky was talking about. And I guess if there's going to be any progress there, it's going to be through a dialectic between, let's just say, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Pelosi. It seems to me that they're actually working together much better than your comment led on. And I think that it's important. So I would like to press you on that. I think it's very politically important. I think a lot is going to hinge in the next 2 years on whether that kind of a dynamic can be productive or break down.
Well, I think exactly as I to speak to the point about liberals of that sort of centrist liberals of that ilk being on the wrong side of history until it's in the past, the Green New Deal is an idea long overdue. And so what we're seeing now is based on her coming into Congress from a grassroots movement. You've got AOC able to push the very possibility of these kind of discussions that have not been happening. Like Nancy Pelosi is not new to this. So if we are then seeing her being pushed by a grassroots leftist campaign now, all for the better, but I don't think I need to give her credit for that. And I also think, the Green New Deal is such a kind of bold statement and a spectacular statement that I don't think a professional politician doesn't know what she's doing when she refuses to say the words.
I just want to say one thing. I also agree that she doesn't deserve credit for the idea, and the sources of the idea that you're alluding to deserve credit for the idea. But being co-opted politically is actually very often a very good thing for the left. And when there are centrist politicians who are interested in co-opting your ideas, as opposed to people who are saying what Trump said in his speech a couple of days ago, that's a difference that matters. And, the fact is that the truth is Pelosi didn't do anything that we wouldn't expect of her. But she's absorbing some of the pressure, and I think that that's a good thing. You should want that.
If the pressure Astra will say the same thing I'm going to say. Please.
I'm just saying, I just think what you're saying is absolutely true but obvious. And the thing that's been missing is people pushing from the left. That's the new element in this scenario. And we have to, we have a two-party system, and people tend to go rah, rah, rah when their team's in power, or, and we have to break that dynamic. And to me, the people on the inside have to recognize how much they need the outsiders, how much they need that energy. Liberals need to recognize how much they need these democratic socialists to pull the conversation forward. So to me, outsiders are doing their job. They're criticizing and bringing that energy. And AOC is saying, too, the movement, not just me, she can't do it for us, right? But she's encouraging the grassroots to pressure her and keep pressuring. So I think that dynamic, what's interesting about this political moment is people are finally getting it. And that's encouraging.
Can I say a word? I feel like having defended John Stuart Mill, I should now defend Nancy Pelosi, of course. But I think there's an underappreciation here of Nancy Pelosi, if I could say, both as a human being. She's accomplished much more in her life than AOC or than a whole lot of people in Occupy Wall Street and other such movements in terms of advancing liberal and progressive causes, some of them quite important, as well as her personal achievement, which is not trivial, of becoming Speaker of the House in 2007. And in fact, she is the best hope we have now, for now, of stopping Trump and defeating Trump. And it was very important that she defeated him in the showdown, and she held Democrats together, and she knew how to do that, and it wasn't so obvious that that was going to work out in December.
Did you say we?
What's that?
Did you say we? You said we.
I did
See,
say
my
we.
hopes of conversion just
EJ,
keep getting built up.
as
You're
EJ
going to disappoint me someday, Bill. I know it.
I feel like I let you live up to EJ. That was why I took that gratuitous shot at EJ just to distance myself, and now, of course, I'm on board with him. Yes, I did say we, because you know what? When there's a serious threat to liberal democracy, it's important to defend it. Yes. And no, I don't want to patronizing, I know, because the fact is, not everyone at this table agrees with that, or some people put more value on other things, and that's obviously their right, and they can make that argument. I think it's extremely foolish, and you can all go on and on about the underlying causes of Trump and economic issues and all that. At the end of the day, if Trump isn't dealt with, if the infection of Trump isn't dealt with, you can't deal with the underlying causes. It's like an infection you have to deal with if you want to have hope of having successful further medical operations and surgery and so forth. And people can be glib about it. A lot of people in the 20th century were very glib about the threats of fascism. A lot of people on the left, you know, nach Hitler uns, that was a left-wing statement. And it wasn't said by terrible people or mean-spirited people. It was said by people who, however, were killed by the Nazis and who did nothing to help the resistance to the Nazis. So a little more old-fashioned social democracy on the one hand and Christian democracy on the other, to pick up, was that EJ's phrase or someone's phrase, I think is kind of important in this moment.
James, and then, yes, Bill.
Okay, yeah, I would want to close with another word in favor of social democracy. This is not a body of reformist ideas that was born in Occupy. It dates back to the early 20th century, and not just in the US, but throughout Europe. And we haven't pushed as far or as hard in the United States for social democracy as many of us think we should, but it's been on the agenda of the Democratic Party since Franklin Roosevelt's 1944 campaign, and it's called for a second Bill of Rights. So I think we stand a lot better chance on the left of being successful if we locate our positions in an American tradition rather than suggesting that they're brand new and that nobody has ever thought of them before. And I want to go a step further and go back to the 18th century. Now, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were slaveholders. Everybody knows that. They also believed that democracy was not possible given vast inequalities of wealth. And it's odd for us to think about slaveholders holding that position. But they both believed, as did John Adams, along with believing in natural aristocracy, that a democracy only works if everybody who is a citizen, and they had a limited conception of who should be citizens, but I think the point was accurate. If everybody who is a citizen, and that now includes everyone, feels that they have an equal share in the economy as well as the polity. From the beginning, it seems to me, this notion of representative democracy had an economic as well as a political dimension to it. And it's been, I think, important for many people in the United States ever since the origins of the Cold War to deny that economic dimension. But the principal thrust of my book, Toward Democracy, is that democracy from the outset was conceived as something that was not limited simply to the question of rights. And it seems to me that if we view the founders as other, if we demonize them as we continue to do on the left, we rob ourselves of the opportunity of finding at the very point of origin of the United States a commitment to most of the principles that we hold for economic equality as well as political rights. Now, their conception of who should be included in that citizenry was very different from ours, but they were committed to the same idea of equality that I think is central to democracy, central to liberal democracy, and I think central to social democracy for a century now.
Bill, yes, thank you. Bill Golson.
Oh, just Jim, I assume you do know that we know what the Green New Deal is referencing as the original New Deal. We don't think social democracy started at Occupy. We don't think that. That's why I referenced John Rawls and the New Deal. Okay, just so you're not worried about the youth.
Bill, yeah.
I think that what I'm about to say will build sympathetically on what Jim Kloppenberg just said. We have seen this movie before. And we saw it in the 1930s. And the record will show that liberal democracy had the capacity to reckon with profound economic changes and challenges and respond to them in both institutional and policy terms in ways that saved what was most valuable about it. The alternatives on the left and the right failed abysmally. And I honestly don't think that anything has changed since. We face now the same kind of challenge that we faced in the early 1930s. I see no reason to believe that as a structural matter, the institutions that we now have are incapable of responding to that. The fact that they haven't responded to them up to now is no evidence that they can't. And the question is, if not through those mechanisms, how? If not to those ends, to what other ends? I am unwilling to sacrifice what is desirable about liberal democracy in the name of something else, because in the experience of the past century, every alternative to liberal democracy has been worse than liberal democracy, and I do not believe that that fundamental reality has been changed by anything that has happened in the past generation.
Aziz, yeah.
So I guess I'm less sanguine about the state of the institutions, and I think that we're going to have a really transformative imagination that actually includes thinking about how the rules of the game are themselves written. And to me, the reason is because of an historically concrete assessment of the difference between now and the 30s. So if you look at the 1930s, yes, the US was able to develop a limited social welfare state, but the conditions for it was the existence of an incredibly powerful labor movement that in the economy could put extreme pressure at the point of production and really shut down the functioning of large productive sectors. And that had the benefit of massive supermajorities that it could organize politically. And it was these supermajorities that were necessary to overcome the incredible array of institutional checks and roadblocks that made just ordinary policy virtually impossible during the Gilded Age. I mean, 1936, FDR not only wins an election unparalleled since John Monroe runs unopposed basically in 1820, but has 75% of the House and the Senate, and 80% essentially including like-minded Republicans. I mean, those were the conditions necessary for the passage of policies that today we don't think of as even all that extreme. Unemployment insurance, so, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what that tells us is that, the institutional limitations on the capacity to actually impose meaningful social change are really extreme. And then there are other kinds of cultural predicates too, which is not just the massive numbers from the labor movement, but you have World War II and the Cold War that actually shift elements of both parties toward a center, so where there's far greater compromise on being able to maintain both a set of policies about what you can think of as economic moderation as well as racial moderation in the face of a perceived antagonist in the Soviet Union, that you have real reasons why the country was able to implement these policies, and none of those cultural and political predicates exist in the present. You have the end of the Cold War, you have intense party polarization, you have the demobilization of the labor movement, and instead now you have institutions that have all of the same checks and constraints, and so it's really hard to imagine how you're going to end up implementing these policies if you don't, in fact, systematically address the institutions themselves. And that means you're going to have to talk about things like the nature of the Senate, lifetime appointments on the Supreme Court, the structure of gerrymandering, the extent to which money basically undermines the entirety of the political process. And that actually requires going to like foundational questions about the institutions themselves. If we avoid those foundational questions, we're going to have the same basic crises recur over and over again, while claiming at the same time that somehow magically the institutions of liberal democracy, which have in fact failed, are going to solve the problem. That seems fantastical to me.
Well, if I may, granting arguendo, as you folks say, the truth of everything you just said, what exactly are you proposing? What processes are you proposing to achieve institutional change?
Yeah, so it strikes me that, the goal can't be, okay, we should have a new constitutional convention, because that this is not a circumstance to just write abstractly a set of new arrangements. But it must be thinking about policies on the ground that would dramatically elevate the practical power that working people have, and not dividing between economic and institutional shifts. And so it seems that, on the one hand, pressing for the things that are associated with the Green New Deal, with guaranteed job, but then also really thinking about, well, what are institutional devices that would alter the extreme degree of counter-majoritarianism that marks our constitutional system. So everything from statehood for DC and Puerto Rico to taking seriously what one person, one vote would mean. So ending felony disenfranchisement across the various states, to addressing the problems of lifetime appointments on the Supreme Court. I mean, so these are to thinking about pegging voting rights to residency, not citizenship. I mean, these are dramatic changes that have a kind of degree of imaginative possibility that are far beyond what have been on the table, and are certainly not what the traditional mainstream within the parties have contemplated. But just like in the 30s, the stuff that ended up being implemented during the New Deal, that's stuff that was seen as beyond the imaginative horizon. And that's, we're going to have to think in some of the same way, like beyond what are viewed as the limitations of the mainstream debate.
I have Jim, EJ, and Marc, and then Astra.
I'm going to try to intervene and mediate, if possible, because one of the things that's been lurking in the background of this whole conversation is a certain tension between institutional and particularly party systems and the rule of law, and the extra parliamentary repertoire of intervention and protest and dissent, which has risks attached to it, but it has high creative potential, as you've just pointed out, in terms of the 1930s. And when I listen to Natasha Lennard, one generous way to take her suggestion, if you're on the left, is that she's proposing an outside-inside strategy where you work from the outside to create constant pressure through democratic, all the mechanisms of democratic protest and revolt, with all of the potential liabilities of that. But that's one way to sort of push people like Pelosi on the inside, to the left. And I took her to be saying, and again, in a charitable reading, that liberals need this, because if they don't have this pressure from the outside, they end up going squishy and, not really stepping up to the plate, particularly in terms of economic democracy. Okay? Now, as a veteran of the New Left, which the whole theme of SDS was supposed to be inside, outside, and went off the rails, and there's a bad sort of historical train wreck that happens in the 60s in that case. I think there's something to be said about that, and I think that we do live in an era in which there are recurrent uprisings, popular uprisings, and new forms of political expression. And they've been historically consequential going back to the Yellow Revolution, say, in the Philippines. But I also want to add, I didn't do this in my introductory remarks, it seemed too much. But last night, I wrote my book about democracy because not because of, I wasn't worried about the 1930s and the New Deal. I was in Poland, and I had the feeling, holy cow, this was 5 years ago. This is Weimar 1933 happening again. And what are we going to do? I can't believe what I'm seeing. And this is way before Trump even hove into view. So what I was going to say last night is essentially that, and I think this is to Bill Kristol's point, is that I feel like we're at this existential moment in which it really is like 1933 in Germany in certain ways. And when you split the left and the liberals and the socialists, and and they start bickering among each other and say, oh, yeah, fine, let's sharpen the contradictions. That's one of the ways that Hitler came to power. And the danger in the present moment of a fracturing is something that that's why I wrote my book. I felt it keenly, that it was like, there comes a time where, look, liberal democracy is worth fighting for despite all these other problems, and despite the fact that I'm perfectly willing to countenance all kinds of extra parliamentary modes of intervening. But at this particular moment, in a way, it's what's behind the whole conference, is that, it seems to me we need to sort of hash that out and stand together. That's my own view. And shoulder to shoulder, as far as I'm concerned, with Astra Taylor and Bill Kristol and Marc Plattner and Michael Tomasky, and I'm not going to name everybody, but that's just the way I feel. I mean, it's kind of corny, but
DJ.
Just to underscore that last point, the most dangerous and most foolish piece of political strategy in history was the German KPD's statement, after Hitler, us. They so hated the Social Democrats that they were not willing to ally with them when it mattered, and it was a catastrophe. But I think you underestimate Natasha's radicalism. I'll get to that. I don't think she wants to deal with the insiders or trusts them. But wait, let me say what I'm going to say, and then you can go on. I want to say I agree with everything Mike said, everything Jim said, and also just about everything Aziz said. I think on Mike's point, and this is really goes as a question to Bill, which is you were very eloquent in defending liberty, but I think what Mike was underscoring is that preserving liberty requires a particular social context. It requires, I think in particular, a degree of economic equality, because otherwise you fall into oligarchy, or the great mass of people lose faith in the system that you are defending, and with reason. Jim's point about the founders, I think, is very important. Ganesh Siddharaman wrote a very interesting book a couple of years ago, The Decline of the Middle Class Constitution. I had it up here, and I've lost it, where he was basically arguing that our Constitution presumes a degree of economic equality. And so I'd like Bill to talk about, we're not going to defend liberty in conditions of radical and growing inequality. And to go to Mike's point, if you talk about democracy and you look at this current Supreme Court, two decisions: one, increase the power of money in politics with Citizens United, and two, decrease the power of excluded groups by undercutting the Voting Rights Act. These are two decisions that are like a pincer movement on the normal operation of democracy. But I want to address a question to Natasha. First of all, I treasure you for remembering Phil Oakes. All these lyrics were going through my head, just before the end, even freedom might be worth a try. This country is too young to, I love Phil Oakes. Who was way more radical than I am. I have a lot of use for the new socialist intervention in politics. I think the socialist intervention is finally broadening our political argument that had gotten really pushed to the right. I couldn't come this morning because I was writing my column, which is kind of a defense of the socialists. The lead of this column is a quote from Jerome Frank, who said, during the New Deal, he was a New Dealer, he said, "We socialists are trying to save capitalism, and the damn capitalists won't let us." And so I welcome this. But I want to specifically ask you about Occupy and this walking away from electoral politics and this walking away from electoral institutions. When I look back at Occupy, what I think about is Occupy had this street strategy that was not only totally divorced from electoral politics, but actually disdained electoral politics. And so while you guys were doing your organizing, which, as you said with that nice lilt of sarcasm, you did change the discussion. The 1% was a powerful creation of an idea and an argument that is still with us. I respect that. But while you guys were doing your thing, Tea Party people were organizing precincts all the way down at the local level. They were winning elections. They were taking over the Congress. And I'll just close with this. 2018 was different because people who were on the left and on the center left and the handful of conservatives who were like Bill all said enough. And at a very local level, place by place, county by county, precinct by precinct, they said elections actually matter. And they're the only route toward power. We need the outside pressure. You need outside groups. But without electoral power, there can be no power, and you can't get what you want.
Well, look, I completely agree. I was 21 years old during Occupy. I also think that's worth keeping in mind.
But I'm sorry, I took you seriously, very seriously in defending Occupy's idea, which is why I sort of offer my polemic.
No, and as I say, it was a kind of multi-pronged set of ideas in terms of a temporal taking of space and intervention. I was also talking about all the 2011 square movements. So that could be talking about Spain, that could be talking about syntagma, not all of which were specifically and entirely antagonistic to electoral politics. Indeed, the rise of Syriza in Greece would have been little without the Syntagma Square movement. So I certainly...
But the flip side is true, right? He wouldn't have won without electoral action.
Right, no, of course, co-constitutive, obviously. But the point being, if there was a resentment and a distrust in representative democracy at that time, that was an element of it. But the left, who were building grassroots, getting people on city councils, the people behind a lot of the Justice Democrats campaigns, were people who kind of came of age and came of politicization in Occupy. So maybe it does take a learning and a coming together in a movement context to then be able to enact together at a given time on an electoral landscape. That we happened to be doing that in 2011 and were teenagers then, and some older and configuring ideas and collectivity then, and not immediately able to apply that at exactly the same time the Tea Party were, I'm not sure is entirely our fault.
Well, hey, thank you. I'd much rather be on your side than against you, and in many ways, your arguments were very powerful and well made, but I think that acknowledging that that boring old electoral action is absolutely essential to change.
I do want to say, though, that Occupy was very small. It cast a big shadow, partly because of social media, but it was very small. And for me, what was striking, because I did go, and I was 30, was how many of my liberal friends didn't go because they didn't like the aesthetics. And my argument was, this is what we've got to counter the Tea Party. You don't get to pick the style of the social movement. And there's one sign that I love very much, and it said, I love democracy more than I hate this drum circle, right? And a lot of people rejected Occupy based on stylistic things. It's like, that's what we had at that moment to change the conversation, and we could have done more because it was open, and you could have come, and you could have taken Occupy in the direction you wanted it. And so I think it's not on the handful of occupiers who mostly were young people coming onto a left where there was no institutional memory. there was, this sort of void. And I think it's actually quite amazing how fast people have learned and are engaging in organization, engaging in insider-outsider strategies, thinking about the dialectic and how to engage the Pelosis of the world, when they actually emerged into quite a vacuum.
I have Marc, Jessica, and Yuval. Marc.
Yes. I'm not used to hearing arguments really that question the worth of liberal democracy altogether. I think I've heard them today, although I'm not sure. And I guess my question really is, well, what do you replace it with? There was some discussion, certainly from Aziz, of institutional reforms that one might attempt. But I guess my broader question really is, there are now 120 democracies in the world. The United States is not the only one. Maybe we have the longest history. Are there others that you think are great successes that we should be emulating as a parliamentary versus presidential democracy? Is it the nature of courts? I mean, there are now all kinds of combinations out there that one could look at. It used to be in these kinds of discussions, one would hear appeals to the Scandinavian social democracies. I haven't heard any of those today. So I guess my question is, what is it that you are willing to take the risks of supplanting liberal democracy? For what are you willing to take those risks? What is the goal that's not a utopian goal?
You're asking Aziz.
Yeah, so,
certainly.
So the first thing, in a way, it actually connects to this exchange. The thing to me that I think is really remarkable about the generation that came of age post-Occupy is the commitment to political praxis and pragmatism. And it's precisely the fact that, what is it that the new generation of socialists did? They attempted to take over the Democratic Party by creating institutional networks that could mobilize within the terms of the party rather than extra-institutionally, saying that we might need something like a new march through the institutions. And that's why, it's a striking thing here, because I don't see the socialist challenge as really a challenge to liberal democracy writ large. Exactly. The whole challenge is to say that the principles of liberal democracy have not been achieved through the existing institutions and through the way that capitalism is organized, and that to actually achieve those principles, constitutionalism, significant commitment to rights protections, a general provision of material wealth, requires a much more sustained engagement with the project of democracy. So it means an expansive New Deal-like social democratic vision of how the economy is organized, bound to far more genuinely democratic underlying institutions. I have a theory of how I think representative democracy should work, in the abstract. I tend to think parliamentary democracies are much more genuinely democratic than presidential systems. I think you need parallel institutions organized through strong unions, churches, labor, civil rights movement associations. But in the simplest terms, really what we're talking about is reinvesting in both the civil society and political apparatus of actual democracy and making liberalism actually true to what its commitments are. And you can think of Scandinavia, you could say that we've never really had democracy globally, but nonetheless we have incipient versions of political possibility, and we need to take those seriously as the condition for our future.
Could I just say on one point you made, which I think really needs to be underscored, which is the decline of the labor movement and the failure to create, either to revive the old labor movement or more likely to create new forms of representation for people at the bottom end of the income distribution. I think that has to be central to reviving democracy itself.
I'm going to wait. I think Jessica's been waiting to come in here.
That's fine. I want to. What?
One little one. We could try the old-fashioned labor movement again. If everybody got to vote whether or not they wanted to be into a union, the membership would triple. Sorry. The membership, if everyone got to vote who works, whether or not to be in a union, the labor movement, the old-fashioned kind, the one that just negotiates with their employer, would triple. And we could have an institution change. It could be HR2, and it could be card check. We could just make the laws enable people to vote for unions that they clearly want.
Jessica,
I appreciate very much the discussion of concrete institutional change and concrete policy. I guess I just want to offer an observation rather than a solution as we consider the modalities of change. And that observation is simply, can you hear me? Yeah. So as we discuss modalities of political change, I simply want to offer an observation of the incredible privilege that we are expressing, and the specifically American privilege that we are expressing as we discuss the future of liberal democracy. In some ways, how important this conversation is, but how cavalier we are in thinking about whether or not we ought to keep liberalism or democracy or both, or our flawed institutions, how untempered by national experiences of suffering our discussion is, how uncomprehending of how much harder and bloodier all of this could be, and how little it takes to push a society into a very different place. And so I guess I'd like to join Jim in his corny call for us to well, as one of my friends put it around the time of the 2016 elections, if you want to express yourself, go buy a pair of red sneakers. But as for the rest of it, that we stand shoulder to shoulder, and that we have these conversations, but that we value what it is that we do have. That's all.
Yuval, please.
Well, thanks. I think what I have to say is a little strange, but it does build on what Bill has said and on what Jim has said and on what's just been said too. I have a bizarre sense of deja vu in listening to the conversation as a little bit of an outsider. I'm a conservative. I'm a Trump critic because I'm a conservative, but I'm a conservative. And this sounds to me in some particular ways like the sorts of conversations that the right was having in 2010, 2 years into the Obama administration, where there was a passionate force for change. I can gather what you think of the Tea Party, and some of that's right, but there was a passionate force for change. And people were convinced in that group that if only the public got to vote, it would vote for them, and that if only we could clear all of the anti-majoritarian institutions, then there would be victory. And it had an entirely negative approach to the institutions. It did put people up for election to Congress, that's true, EJ, but the purpose of that was to eliminate the people who were in Congress, right? It was to vote people out. It was very hard to see how they were thinking about using the institutions. There was a lot of anger at the court. There was talk of a constitutional convention. Again, this sense that if only these people were out of the way, everything would work out. And what it did, in effect, was it turned the activists against the party and against all institutions and left people open to an appeal that was just pure substanceless anger. And, you know, one of the strangest things that happened on the right was that the very voters who voted in the Tea Party voted in Donald Trump. Even though if you listen to them in terms of public policy, what the Tea Party and Donald Trump said were actually very, very different things. But if you don't listen to them in terms of public policy, if you listen to them in terms of tone and attitude toward the establishment, they were very similar things. And I would just, part of what I learned from that experience is that we have to be very careful about our attitude toward our institutions, which are fragile and which are enormously important for the protection of basic rights and of minority rights and of the structure of our politics. And all of this is much more fragile than it might seem. So that the solution to dysfunctional and illegitimate institutions is more functional and more legitimate forms of those institutions. And that means investing ourselves in the institutions, not looking at them in purely negative terms, not thinking that if only we got rid of them, and if only there was pure democracy, then everything would go well. I don't think the public thinks the way you think they do. And the system we have protects us from ourselves. It protects us from bad elites and bad publics. It means change has to happen slowly, not that it doesn't happen, and it can be extremely frustrating. But it is very, very important that we see why that system is there, because the alternatives, it seems to me, again, as mostly an outsider to the conversation that's developed in this particular session, the alternatives are darker than you think.
Sophia, yes, please.
So I think the exciting thing is that there are new ideas on the table. In other words, not new in the sense of new to history, but revived in new forms, that we are having conversations about policies and ideas that are being taken very seriously that weren't 5 years ago. So I think one terrific thing that's happened is the opening up of new areas of contestation, and good if there's disagreement about them. I mean, the Green New Deal, good, people are talking about it. Everybody doesn't have to agree right off the bat, but it changes the conversation. But I do see two kind of intractable problems, one of which we've talked about a little bit, one we haven't really, that maybe concern democracy's future. One is, I agree entirely with Aziz, that the institutions themselves are in need of reform, the formal procedures. But how do you do that? I mean, in other words, if you have a dysfunctional Congress and Congress needs to no longer be dysfunctional, but they're too dysfunctional to be able to change the pattern, it's very hard to see. It's not just voting in a new president. Congress itself isn't working, but how do you what are the mechanisms for making Congress more effective? And that's really tied to the second one, which is, we keep talking about a public and majorities, but since most people don't vote, or a vast majority don't, I don't know if we're talking about the public meaning everyone, or the public meaning voters. And it's very hard to figure out how to get everybody to vote. Now, we could have compulsory elections, but again, that would require a government sort of structural changes that we can't actually affect without voters. So, I mean, there's a kind of catch-22 to all of this that I see the two. Aside from the question of who's president right now, there seemed to me, and aside from the fact that a great thing has been a revival of democratic energy and ideas, the difficulty of reforming institutions from inside with a voting public that not only do people not vote, but it's increasingly hard for many people to vote with forms of voter suppression, et cetera, that means we don't really have necessarily the power to change those institutions through the franchise. I'm no expert here. I'm not a political scientist, and I'm not an expert in any sense, but those seem to me deeply difficult problems.
Right. I have Marc, then Astra. Marc.
Okay, I guess my remarks were really referring to an earlier part of the discussion where socialism and role of trade unions and so on were invoked. It seems to me that trade unions played a marvelous role in the development of liberal democracy in the 20th century, but they're shrinking in the United States. They're shrinking throughout the industrialized world. Socialism, again, it depends how one defines it. Doesn't strike me as a new idea or a promising idea. I think certainly there are many people, given their experience living under communist regimes, find the term very distasteful. I'm a little bit puzzled by the revival of it here in the U.S. Maybe it will prove to have legs, I don't know if that's the word. Maybe it will continue to attract more supporters, but somehow I'm skeptical about it. And again, one could say social democracy, but that's, basically what we have in Europe, in many countries in Europe, seems to me not that different from American-style liberal democracy. But there again, too, the social democratic and socialist parties in Europe are drastically losing support. So somehow the discussion seems to have an unreal quality to me. I don't stop there.
Yes. Okay, so to pick up on the idea of a real quality, so this has been a rather abstract discussion, and so I want to put on my organizer hat. So I was part of a group called the Debt Collective that launched the first ever student debt strike in 2015. We began with 15 strikers. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times announcing it. A few hundred people joined, and then we created an app that allowed tens of thousands of people to dispute their debts using a right that they had, according to the Higher Education Act, but that was never articulated clearly. So only 2 or 3 people in decades had used this, had tried to enact this right. And we suddenly flooded Obama's Department of Education with tens of thousands of applicants. We built an app that was catered to each state. It was very complicated. So then we mobilized groups, and we want to change to a clarification of this right. So we changed to federal law that said, finally, people who are defrauded by their schools have the right to debt relief, which really matters because your student loans cannot be erased in bankruptcy. And we've won, through the lawsuits we've been involved in, et cetera, over $1 billion of student debt relief for students who went to predatory for-profit colleges. But we are fighting a Department of Education that is corrupt in the sense that it was basically funneling money to these private colleges that are totally criminal enterprises. I mean, Google them, right? Look at the lawsuits against them. And we're trying to tell our members, no, you have to still believe that the institutions can do better, right? We have to make the Department of Education better. Education should be a right. Let's fight for a different system. But the system is so corrupt. So I'm asking people, we're talking about, be careful about condemning the institutions, but how do we actually fix them without calling attention to how corrupt they actually are? And so when you're an organizer, this is a real challenge. It's not something, you can't just go, you're so great, by the way, you've totally ruined my life and the life of millions, right? So how do we square this circle?
We're going to take a question or two, but we don't have much time. If anyone has a question, please say your name and just ask a question. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Rob House, I teach at NYU Law School, and I had a direct response to, I think it's Natasha. So the retort of AOC to the rather contemptuous expression of Pelosi Green Dream was a wonderful, almost Disraeli-like retort. Well, yeah, dream is a nice word, and what she evoked is the fact that every transformative project starts with a dream. Martin Luther King, right? I have a dream. And so the brilliance of AOC is that now is Pelosi actually going to clarify that she meant dream in a pejorative way when she was referring to the Green New Deal. So this brings me to the idea that somehow there's a purely cooperative relationship between AOC and Pelosi. If you only looked at Fox, you would think that AOC is all lion and no fox. But in fact, I think that she understands the dynamics of power, and it's a strategic decision to cooperate with Pelosi. And over time, she will isolate people like Pelosi so that they won't really have an effective political base, and more of them will have to worry about being primaried. But the forces that she was dealing with in coming into Congress, I think, pushed her into at least the appearance of a cooperative relationship. But but as one goes down the way to the path that she's taking, I would look for something very different in the future. And just one brief factual point about Occupy, it certainly was long before 2018 that the movement started working towards electoral politics. I remember this because when Zephyr Teachout challenged Cuomo in 2014, I had one of the first fundraisers for her in my apartment, like 12 blocks from here. So it was already happening, and certainly it's not something produced by Trump, unlike I think what Mr. Dion was suggesting.
Would anyone like to respond to that? That was a statement rather than a question. Okay, yes, Jeff.
I'm going to try to ask my questions very compactly, and then if necessary, I'll explain more fully. So, thinking about Ira Katznelson's celebration of the New School and the two foundational moments of the New School, the liberalism of hope and the fearful liberalism. I want to ask Natasha,
Everyone, stop.
do you realize that you need liberal democracy, that if you abandon it, you're likely to repeat the horrors of the 20th century? Bill Kristol. Bill, do you realize that the liberty you love requires the work of Natasha?
Pass. Thanks, Bill. I think we might have fallen onto some tricky semantic territory, because I perhaps was not clear enough in my rundown of liberal democracy as it has developed in the 20th century, and particularly its formation through neoliberalism, through which I lived under the Blair years, I would say are worth dramatic letting go of and uprooting if we want to reconfigure something like liberal democracy to mean perhaps something more like John Rawls would have had in mind, perhaps, but that is not what liberal democracy has come to mean, and I think it's dangerous when we don't apply terms as they are currently used, because then we're not speaking about a discourse that makes absolute sense. For example, the decrial of the liberal. When people decry the liberal, they're not talking about a kind of great pre-20th century tradition, they're talking about Jonathan Chait, quite rightly. So I think that's really what I'm talking about. I'm not particularly into babies being thrown out with bathwaters, but I'll keep the baby or the bathwater, I don't know. But definitely radical change within. Bill wanted to say something.
Bill, yes. Bill. Come on,
I said
Bill.
no too. No.
I mean, I suppose, I'm sorry, I missed last night, so I missed Ira Katznelson's talk, but if I could guess, maybe. I mean, I guess I'll put it this way. I think liberal democracy is better. I respect, of course, many of the true founders of the New School, the 1919 founding, I suppose, the New Republic founding, if you want to call it that, the John Dewey founding. I respect Dewey in particular because, unlike other progressives, he both opposed fascism and communism quite courageously in the late 30s and organized with Sidney Hook, his student, the denunciations of the show trials and so forth, which is impressive as he had a certain moral strength, I think, that was in defense of liberal democracy. At the end of the day, though, the university in exile form of skeptical liberalism, is that the right term, or I don't know, whatever you want to call it, Hannah Arendt or Leo Strauss or whatever, is deeper, I think, in its understanding of the challenges to liberal democracy, the fragility of liberal democracy, and the institutional and constitutional underpinnings of liberal democracy than Dewey's progressivism. I mean, that's obviously something that would have to be fully debated, but I'm just saying I'm more on the university in exile side of the New School than the New Republic progressive side of the New School.
We're going to have one more question, but a question. Yes. Yeah?
Well, as a mother of 4 20-year-olds and as a high school teacher, I am very aware that the younger you are, the less likely you are to like this word liberal. And you're more likely to agree with Natasha's understanding of what it means as opposed to the broader, more historical understanding of what it means that we heard about last night from William Rosenblatt. So my question really is, what are we going to do about these youngins? Okay, we've got to teach them some civics, and we've got to do it soon. And I'm wondering, because we haven't had a draft in a very long time, if it really is time for national service, a mandatory service, so that you realize citizenship comes with some real obligations, and you can't get out of this year no matter what. You've got to give it to your country, and maybe that would get kids to realize that they should learn something about government, something about how it works, something about what they believe, and maybe even, as you pointed out, vote. Maybe they would start exercising the vote. My question is, does anybody agree with that?
We have a question and answer here, right here.
I don't, thanks. I don't agree with that. There's a generational thing going on here. There are a number of different dynamics going on in this conversation, but like, we're not, the House, first of all, I want to say two things. The House of Representatives is very far from being taken over by AOC. And I'll start worrying about that when there are 40 DSA people in a House of Representatives with 435, or when there are 50. The energy is terrific. The ideas, the Green New Deal is really not even so radical. But the other thing I want to say is not only, no, we don't need to educate the youngins. I mean, we need to listen to them. I'm a little bit surprised. I'm a little bit surprised at the incredulity. I don't agree necessarily with everything that Natasha said, but like the extent to which she's being the object of like incredulity surprises me as someone who writes and teaches on a college campus and reads a wide range of periodicals that we all do. And these ideas are in the air. The questioning is very real, and it's a sign of something important, and it comes along with some good ideas. That doesn't mean all the ideas are good, but it's okay to be challenged.
Yes?
That's nice to say, and I mean, of course, I would just say that is, of course, one should listen to everyone. Good ideas could be presented equally, and often are presented by young people, not by older people, and older people have their views distorted by all kinds of nostalgia and lack of appreciation of the new moment. And the same Lincoln address, if I can just cite him one more time, in which he uses the phrase last best hope of earth. That's the same address in which he famously writes, I think it's a written statement to Congress, a message to Congress, in which he famously writes that we need to think anew because our times are entirely anew. So I'm all for that. I'm also not for the flattery of young people, which we had in the late 60s and which did not end well, where we're learning from them. God forbid we should teach them anything, you know. They have all these deep insights into how the world works. I mean, I'm not for that any more than I am for excessive deference to the elderly. And I think it's a disservice to pretend, I'll just say right now, that the Green New Deal, as it now stands from the document I've looked at, is a serious proposal.
I believe in completely flattering the young.
May I ask
That's the
all of
distortion
us,
of your
please,
job, you know?
all of us, please, to really thank Jim and Helena for these wonderful days.
And I want to thank all of you for soldiering on through a long day of, I thought, very rich conversation, and thank you.
We can take a rain check?
Yeah, I hope so too. I really.
There are books for sale.
We come to Washington a lot.
Yeah, oh, it's.